Hello, this is our paper, The Symbiotic Tensions of the Regulatory Carceral State, the Case of Cannabis Legalization. I am Gil Rothschild-Elyassi.
And I'm Ely Aaronson. Given present concerns about police brutality and mass incarceration, an important question that poses itself again and again in recent years is what should be done about the expansion of the carceral state and its racialized modes of social control. In this paper, we critically examine an influential liberal reform agenda that aspires to scale back the carceral state by funneling responsibilities out of its purview and into that of the regulatory state. We use the case study of cannabis legalization to elaborate this critique. We first outline in detail the analytical distinctions between two forms of governance, regulatory versus carceral. In broad strokes, we suggest that while regulatory governance seeks to maximize individual compliance with predefined rules, carceral governance operates for containing populations that are being classified as unruly or dangerous. Accordingly, whereas regulatory governance employs various mechanisms of persuasion and inducement and uses punishment as a last resort, carceral governance relies extensively on coercive and exclusionary mechanisms of social control. In the article, we built on recent critiques of a common social scientific tendency to characterize the essence of the state by foregrounding a single logic of governance. For example, the regulatory state, the carceral state, the welfare state, the national security state, etc. This characterization represents a monomorphic approach because it emphasizes the dominance of a single morph of the state while ignoring its forms of interaction with other morphs. In turn, this view gives rise to a linear historiographic approach that portrays a definite rupture between distinct types of states, as in the much discussed transition from the welfare state to the regulatory state. When applied to the context of liberal criminal justice reform, this view implies that the creation of regulatory alternatives to criminalization shifts entire policy domains from the purview of the carceral state to that of the regulatory state. In the article, we challenge the monomorphic perspective, and instead, we develop a polymorphic approach that investigates how regulatory and carceral forms of governance exist simultaneously and how they complement and counteract one another. From a polymorphic perspective, the relationship between the regulatory and carceral morphs is bidirectional and nonlinear. We suggest that this relationship is best described in terms of symbiotic tension.
This perspective provides an original vantage point from which to analyze the complex governance consequences of cannabis legalization reforms and other projects of devising regulatory alternatives to criminalization. First, we argue that contrary to common wisdom, legalization implies more rather than less state intervention in drug markets. Legalization leads to the diversification of regulatory strategies and the delegation of regulatory power to numerous non-state actors. This contribution aligns with existing research on the myth of deregulation. Second, we show that this notable expansion of the regulatory state vis-a-vis drug-related behaviors continues to channel large sections of society to the carceral state. To illustrate this, we can consider one provision that is common in most legalization regimes. In essence, this provision limits cannabis use to private spaces and prohibits use in public space. We explain how this provision, like numerous other regulatory provisions, effectively conditions the legality of cannabis use on the already existing distribution of resources. Thus, those with minimal access to private spaces, including unhoused folks, public housing residents, and poor people who may have little to no control over the spaces they inhabit, may not be able to use cannabis legally, and so they effectively remain under the ambit of the carceral state. Not coincidentally, these segments of society whose access to the regulatory domain is structurally inhibited tend to belong to racialized and economically marginalized communities. In other words, they tend to be poor, Black, brown, indigenous, or immigrants. In this reality, legalization sustains a bifurcated governance structure in which regulatory and carceral forms of governance do not replace, but rather complement one another by applying to different populations. The regulatory state applies to those with sufficient resources and ability to comply with regulatory requirements, while the carceral state continues to target predominantly the same populations who have long borne the brunt of the war on drugs. This analysis bears on timely debates between reformist and abolitionist perspectives concerning the question of what should we do next. In short, a transformative polymorphic approach does not foreground individual behavior, but rather the underlying conditions that divide our polities into segregated and unequal worlds. In turn, this approach shifts focus from the question of how to maximize compliance or even govern behavior under existing conditions to the question of how to create conditions that allow all communities to shape governance institutions and fully partake in social and public life. Legalization should begin with promoting racial and economic justice. Otherwise, it may effectively sustain long-standing histories of racialized social control. Thank you.